On PrimeTime Politics tonight, the Ontario Premier officially launches the Ontario election campaign for a vote June 2nd. We'll set the scene for the campaign with veteran journalist Rob Benzie. In the absence of a visit to Ukraine by the Prime Minister, MPs considered their own trip to the war-torn country to show Canada's support. MPs on the Foreign Affairs Committee will debate Canada's ongoing response to the war. And our panel of parliamentary reporters on the political fallout in Canada of a potential abortion ruling in the United States and more. We'll begin tonight with the election campaign in Ontario. It is set to kick off tomorrow. Premier Doug Ford met with the Lieutenant Governor Elizabeth Dowdeswell this afternoon to ask that she dissolve the provincial parliament for an election on June 2nd. To be clear, the parties have already been unofficially campaigning for weeks now, with both the NDP and Liberals having already released their campaign platforms. Rob Benzie is Queen's Park Bureau Chief for the Toronto Star. He's with me now. Rob Benzie, good to see you again. Look, let's start with the key ballot box question for Ontario voters. Do we know what that is yet?
You know what, Peter? It still remains to be seen. I think if Conservative leader Doug Ford would like it to be about building the economy up and building after the pandemic. I think that the New Democratic leader, Andrea Horwath, and the Liberal leader, Stephen Del Duca, and the Green leader, Mike Schreiner, would like to talk a little bit more about the pandemic and Ford's performance during that two-year health crisis that is still ongoing. It's not over yet, although I think the public certainly seems to have moved on to other issues. So I think the affordability crisis that a lot of Ontarians are feeling with gasoline at $2 a liter almost and grocery prices going up, those are things that all the political leaders are going to have to tackle in some way. Okay, so do you expect, what kind of a role do you expect the pandemic to play and pandemic management to play as we, sort of get into the campaign? Well, I mean, Ford had his stumbles for sure over the two-year pandemic, but he can argue. I don't think he'll argue this, but he could if he so chose. He can argue that Ontario had a better pandemic than Quebec, which had more deaths, even though Ontario has a much bigger population. Quebec has 57% of the population of Ontario, and it's had 15,000 deaths. Ontario has had 13,000 deaths. It's a lot over 2 years, but it's been better here than there. It's been better here per capita than in Manitoba. It's been better than in New York or Michigan. So by those metrics, if you look at Ontario versus its neighbors, it's done well. The problem for the Premier is that how is it done? The other parties can say, yeah, it could have been even better though. We had lockdowns when maybe we shouldn't have, or we ended lockdowns too soon, right. Or our kids were out of school in Ontario in learning virtually longer than any other jurisdiction in North America, Peter. It's quite extraordinary, really, right. How cautious Ford was. And then at other times, last April, for example, a year and a month ago, they opened up too quickly, and then it bit them on the behind. Doug Ford's made it clear he wants to talk about the economy, he wants to talk about rebuilding Ontario, about investments and so on. The Liberals and New Democrats, the official opposition, have already released their platforms. What are the key offerings from those two parties as an alternative to Doug Ford and the Progressive Conservatives? Well, I mean, in fairness, the Liberals haven't released their whole platform yet. They've released a few. The New Democrats have put out their platform, 100-plus page booklet, and the Tory platform came in the form of the budget last Thursday, a $198.6 billion spending plan with an almost $20 billion deficit, Peter, that's higher than it was last year. So that's quite extraordinary. I don't want to cast aspersions on inebriated nautical folk, but the Tories are spending like drunken sailor. You could argue that. That said, the Liberals have some big ticket promises. They haven't put their whole platform out, but they're promising buck a ride for transit that they say would cost $1 billion when maxed out. But I think it would be actually more than that. If you look at in OC Transpo in Ottawa, it's $3.70 a ride. That would be $1 a ride. Here in Toronto, the TTC, which is $3.25, would be $1. A GO train ride in the suburbs of Toronto, that can be as much as $20, could be $1. So that's a huge amount of subsidies. But Del Duca says he wants to get people back on transit. It helps get cars off the road for gridlock, for greenhouse gas emissions, and also is an affordability issue at a time when people are feeling the pinch. What's at stake here for Andrea Horwath? Well, Peter, this is her fourth kick at the can. It's like that Bob Dylan song, Fourth Time Around. from Blonde on Blonde, which I was listening to this morning as I walked into work, coincidentally. And I think if she doesn't win outright, I think she can't stay on as leader. And I don't know if she'd want to. She's been the leader of this party since 2009, since you and I were teenagers, Peter. And she's brought them to where they are now, the cusp of power. When she took over, they had, I think, 12 seats or 10 seats. Now they have 40. She took them from 20 to 40 in the last election in 2018. Now, can she get them over the hump to 63 plus for a majority? That remains to be seen.
All right. Wait, let's quickly finish on this. What do the polls tell us as the campaign gets underway?
Well, according to the Signal, which is the poll tracker the Star uses, the Tories would win another majority government, slim majority, but they would win 68 seats in the 124-member House. The Liberals, the Signal says, are in second, and the New Democrats in third, and the Greens holding their own with one seat. Mike Schreiner in Guelph would be the one that they would win, according to our poll aggregator. But remember, Peter, there's a flurry of polls expected tomorrow, so those numbers are going to change. And, I mean, the campaigns matter. It's a cliche, I know, but lots of things are going to happen over the next month, and that none of the campaigns can foresee.
All right, Rob Benzie, great to get your perspective as the campaign gets underway, and I know we'll get a chance to talk during the campaign. Take care.
You too, Peter. Take care.
As Russia's war on Ukraine continues, a group of Canadian MPs is considering a trip to Ukraine to show Canada's solidarity. The Prime Minister has been facing questions about why he or senior cabinet ministers have not visited Ukraine since the war began, when so many other European and U.S. politicians have. Ukraine's also appealing to Canada for the urgent delivery of more weapons. Ukraine's ambassador to Canada appeared at a parliamentary committee this week and urged Canadian politicians to travel to her country.
To have a feeling and sense of ongoing situation on the ground, we also invite you to visit Ukraine and show a solidarity with Ukrainian government and Ukrainian people in the most darkest times of our modern history.
I'm joined now by three MPs on the Foreign Affairs Committee to discuss Canada's ongoing response to the war in Ukraine. Rachel Bendayan is a Liberal MP and the Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Tourism. Michael Chong is the Foreign Affairs Critic for the official opposition Conservatives, and Heather McPherson is the Foreign Affairs Critic for the NDP. It's good to see you all. Thanks for being here. Ms. Bendayan, let me start with you if I can. 11 Prime Ministers, European Presidents, Chancellors, U.S. senior cabinet members, the Speaker of the House of Representatives, they've all visited Ukraine recently. And I guess a lot of people are wondering why the Canadian Prime Minister hasn't, or any Canadian cabinet ministers for that matter. What's the answer?
Well, thanks, Peter, for the question. And I would just like to start by saying that the ambassador designate for Ukraine came to our Foreign Affairs Committee yesterday, and we all asked her the question in various different ways, and she was quite unequivocal. The thing that the Ukrainians need the most right now is weapons. And I think that, we should be focused on what Ukraine needs right now. That is why howitzers have now been delivered from Canada. That is why there are various shipments of weapons, including a shipment of weapons which arrived even before the invasion from Canada. Right. We are one of the only countries.
She also did invite members of your committee and all Canadian politicians to come and visit Ukraine in its moment of the darkest moments in Ukraine. So will the Prime Minister be going soon?
Well, she invited the members of our committee yesterday, and as I said, we welcome that invitation. We'll be discussing at our committee on Thursday where we will go in order to travel next. I believe.
But should the Prime Minister be there?
I believe that the Sergeant-at-Arms of the House of Commons and other security officials will be advising us of what is possible in terms of travel. I know that I want to go, and that many members of this House would like to go.
I appreciate that. What I'm asking is, should the Prime Minister be going?
And what I am answering is that security is going to advise us what is possible. We have been a stalwart supporter of Ukrainians in their time of need, and I think we should also be focused on what Ukraine needs right now, and what they need is weapons.
Okay, we'll talk about that in a bit too. Mr. Chong, your committee is actively, as we've heard, considering a visit to Ukraine. Let me start with that first question, though. Do you believe the Prime Minister should have visited Ukraine already, or at least senior cabinet members, to show Canada's solidarity?
Yes, I do. I think it's time for either the Prime Minister or a senior minister of this government to go to Ukraine to show solidarity with the government of Ukraine. Many of our allies, as you pointed out in your opening remarks, have already done so. Canada is a G7 country. It's a founding member of NATO. And I think it's important that we show solidarity with Ukraine. Ukraine needs us to provide weapons, yes, but they also need us to show political support for the fight, for their war against Russia. And so that starts with being physically present. And I think it will speak to the institutional capacity of this country, whether or not a minister can get to Ukraine, the prime minister or senior minister of this government, like the Minister of Foreign Affairs, to show solidarity with the government. Surely we have the security and defense capability to ensure the safety and protection of our ministers when they are there, as have other G7 countries.
Heather McPherson, what's your view on this? Should the Prime Minister be going there, or should he have been there, or senior cabinet members? And about your committee heading there as well.
Yeah, I think he should. I think now is the time that he should actually be heading to Ukraine, if not past time. We have a incredibly large Ukrainian diaspora in this country. The Prime Minister has stood up many times in the House and said he is with the Ukrainian people, but he is in fact not with the Ukrainian people. There are, like you mentioned, there are 11 prime ministers who have already gone to Ukraine, or heads of state. There is. I can't imagine a scenario in which it is safe for them, but not safe for our Prime Minister. That said, I think that, I also, like my colleague, Madame Bendayan, welcome the opportunity to go to Ukraine and to have an opportunity to stand with Ukrainians. And I think it's also very important that we recognize this is not enough. This is one piece of the support that we need to provide to Ukraine right now. It is in a large part symbolic and important, but it is a portion of what needs to be provided so that the people of Ukraine get the help they need from Canada.
Let's talk about that. It's come up here at the beginning of our discussion. So Rachel Bendayan, as you touched on, the Ukrainian ambassador pleaded for more prompt delivery of weapons from Canada at your committee hearing yesterday. The budget last month promised $500 million more in military aid for Ukraine, but most of it yet to be allocated. How can that process be accelerated? Because she made it clear this is an urgent need.
The ambassador-designate absolutely made it clear that the urgency was now. We have spent 5 months in the chamber debating our fall economic statement of last fall, and so my plea to my Conservative colleagues is that we should absolutely have robust debate on the budget, but we should pass the budget quickly so that we can get this critical assistance to Ukrainians. I believe that is and it should be our top priority.
All right. Mr. Chong, what's your response to that? The appeal to speed up the process and get the money out the door.
That's incorrect. The estimates process is what will provide the $500 million in additional assistance for Ukraine, and that's completely separate from the fall economic and fiscal update bill, and it's completely separate from the Budget Implementation Act. That's done through the estimates process. The estimates sail through the House of Commons expeditiously each and every year, so I'm confident that that will happen again this springtime. So the question is, what will the government be using that money for? They need to come forward with a detailed plan to provide the lethal weapons that Ukraine has been asking. Look, for years, we have been calling on the government to provide lethal weapons to Ukraine, something they refused to do until Monday, February 14th, the very day the Emergencies Act was invoked. And on that very day, in a little-known announcement, they did a 180 on their policy and decided at that late hour, just 10 days before the invasion of Ukraine, to provide Ukraine with lethal weapons. So better late than never, but they need to get the money out the door and provide and buy the equipment that Ukraine so desperately needs.
Heather McPherson, what's a reasonable timeline to think, based on the appeals you heard from the Ukrainian ambassador? She's clearly aware of the system and how it works, and there is a certain amount of deliberation around, pushing these funds forward, but she made it clear it's urgent. So how do you speed it up?
Well, I mean, first of all, she made it very clear that there's urgent need on a number of different fronts. You know, we've been talking about how sanctions have been rolled out too slowly, and that the Russian oligarchs have been able to hide the money that could have been used to rebuild Ukraine. She talked about the urgent need for defense mechanisms for Ukraine. She talked about the urgent need for Canada to assist with things like demining a field so that the crop can go in, so that people can actually farm wheat, which is going to be a food security problem globally. She spoke about a number of different places where the promises have been made, but the action has been too slow, that there has been such little recognition by this government of the need for speed and urgency in the face of what Ukrainians are facing. So I mean, the quick answer to your question is the government needs to move faster. They need to do more for Ukraine, and they need to do it with urgency. They can't keep announcing and then not actually doing it. It has to go, and it has to go now.
Only have a little bit of time left here, but let's talk about the last sort of piece of this, and that's for a lot of Canadians and a lot of people watching this situation closely, is when will the Canadian embassy in Kiev reopen? Many other countries have either never closed their missions there or have started to reopen them. So Rachel Bendayan, can you give us an idea of when the Canadian embassy in Kiev will reopen?
Thanks for the question, but I would like to push back on what my NDP colleague had said. The ambassador-designate was quite clear that weapons was her priority, and it is something that our government has responded to from the get-go and which the NDP were against at the time. I would like to also recognize how important it is to reestablish our embassy in Ukraine. The Minister of Foreign Affairs has indicated that we are looking to doing so and quickly, but there's obviously also the importance of ensuring the safety and security of our Canadian staff in Ukraine.
Mr. Chong, what's your view on this?
Yes, I believe it's time to reopen the embassy. Many of our closest allies have already reestablished or continued to have a diplomatic presence in Ukraine throughout the last several weeks. The Dutch, for example, have reopened their embassy in Ukraine this week. I think it's time for Canada to do the same.
Okay, and a final comment from you, Heather McPherson, on this.
I think it's unanimous that it absolutely should be happening, and it should be happening as quickly as we can, ensuring the safety, of course, of the staff and the folks that work in the embassy.
All right, I want to thank you all, three of you, for your time tonight. Appreciate it. Take care, and we'll reconnect soon. Bye now.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
A leak from the U.S. Supreme Court of a draft opinion to strike down abortion rights in the U.S. is getting lots of reaction there, of course, and in Canada as well. The leak suggests the U.S. Supreme Court's poised to overturn the 1973 Roe v. Wade ruling that legalized abortion. In this country, here's how Liberal and New Democrat politicians reacted today.
What we need to make sure is that there's no backsliding of women's right to choose here in Canada. And we know right now, as we speak, there's no MPs from the Conservative Party that are willing to answer any of the questions of the journalists today. We also know that there is a leadership race happening as we speak within the Conservative Party, and candidates are all trying to court the anti-choice vote.
What we really need to focus on in Canada is doubling down on making sure everyone has access, meaningful access, where they don't have to drive hundreds of kilometers to go to a hospital or a clinic. That's where we should be putting our efforts. The law is very strong in Canada. The right is protected, but the access is something we need to improve.
I'm joined now by two colleagues from the Parliamentary Press Gallery to discuss some of the key stories of the day. Marieke Walsh is a reporter with the Globe and Mail. John Ivison is a columnist with the National Post and Parliamentary Bureau Chief for Post Media. Good to see you both. Marieke, let me start with you. The Liberals and New Democrats spoke out in defense of abortion rights today in the wake of this news of this draft ruling leaked from the U.S. Supreme Court suggesting the court's about to overturn Roe versus Wade. But Conservatives were largely silent about this today, and you broke this story this morning. What can you tell us about why they're not talking and what might be behind that?
Well, it's just a topic they don't really like to touch, Peter, and that's because they are dealing with many different factions within their party, including social conservatives. And it means that they have a more tricky line that they walk on abortion. They say that they would not introduce any legislation restricting abortion if they form government, but they also allow free votes on it. And we know that interim leader Candice Bergen has previously described herself as pro-life.
All right. John, what are your thoughts on why Conservatives don't want to talk about this now, and how this potential ruling, and we should be clear about that, potential ruling in the United States could affect the Conservative leadership race and how it could be framed by the party's opponents?
Yeah, well, I mean, going back as far as I can remember, every time the subject comes up, the Conservatives get themselves into hot water on the issues of conscience, particularly abortion. I do think that it's wise for them. There's such a divergence of opinion within the Conservative caucus, unlike the Liberal and NDP caucuses, because we know that when Justin Trudeau came in, he made it pretty clear to his caucus, if you were going to run for them, you had to be pro-choice. There were a few pro-lifers still left in the caucus, but they pretty much have kept their heads down, or they've left. So there's a pretty singular view within the NDP and the Liberal parties, which is not the case, obviously, in the Conservative Party. Right. As far as the leadership race, I mean, we have a declared candidate, Leslyn Lewis, who is clearly stated pro-lifer. I'm not particularly sure what Charest's policy is. I would imagine it's probably pro-choice. And Pierre Poilievre, although he plays quite well with some social conservatives, is got a green light from the campaign life, a red light from the campaign life folks. They don't particularly like his stance. Yeah,
they say he's evolved his views from over time, and they don't side with him anymore. Yeah,
so I think there is going to be a backlash against this, particularly in the US, obviously, but I think also in Canada, and therefore you probably better keeping your head down if you are pro-life at the moment, to be honest.
What are your thoughts on that, Marieke, and how this could play out? Again, we should be clear, this is a draft decision, and there is an opportunity for this to change over time, but it certainly raised alarm bells for the pro-choice movement in the United States, and to some extent in Canada as well.
Certainly. And I think the bottom line is it's not good timing for the Conservatives. The Supreme Court in the United States is expected to release its final decision by June. So for the next 2 months, possibly, we're going to have this issue come up every time it comes up in the U.S. and whether it even just continues now in Canada. Jean Charest told us today his campaign, told us today that he is pro-choice, but that he would not whip the vote or prevent private members' bills from coming forward if he formed a Conservative government, which goes exactly to John's point, right? The other parties have made their lives easier in a sense by whipping the vote. The Conservatives have chosen not to, which is why they have a more challenging time addressing this issue, given the mainstream perspective in Canada. But we know today, for example, Liberal MP McKay said in scrums on the way into the House of Commons that he believes that life begins at conception. And so, there are still some Liberals as well who, or at least one, I should say, who is not in line with Justin Trudeau.
John, on the leadership race, in fundraising and caucus support and polling, Pierre Poilievre seems to be well ahead of the other candidates for the Conservative leadership. Debates are coming up. The first one this Thursday in Ottawa. It's not one of the official party debates, but they'll be on the stage together. What will you be watching for as this race moves forward now to see where this story is going?
Well, I think, Poilievre is the prohibitive favourite. The only scenario I could see where he doesn't win is that if Patrick Brown, for example, gets knocked off the ballot and endorses Jean Charest and all of his supporters go. Now, obviously, we've seen this before, that it doesn't really matter what a candidate says to recommend. Members are going to vote the way they're going to vote. But it does seem that Charest and Brown are aligned, and if one or other fell off and made it clear that they would prefer their supporters to go to the other, that could be a scenario in which Charest, I think, would be the favourite to pip Poilievre. I mean, given the fact that only two of them speak French, it seems to me it's a Poilievre versus Charest race. Unfortunately, I believe Patrick Brown is not going to be at this debate on Thursday,
not so far. Yeah.
It's kind of unfortunate because I think the dynamic, I think we could see a bit of a pile-on with Brown and Charest and possibly even people like Scott Aitchison, who I think has some disagreements with the way Poilievre has been campaigning. So, it's all to play for still. We've still got a lot of months and a lot of memberships to sell still.
Marieke, what are your thoughts? What are you watching for as this race moves forward?
Well, I'm constantly reminded, Peter, that the last two leaderships for the Conservatives have not led to the presumptive frontrunner actually winning. So I think it's just a good reminder for how messy these ranked ballots can be to predict, and how, how many different things are going on behind the scenes when people are jockeying for that down ballot support. Certainly, I think the debate will give us a sense of the dynamics, how much they are attacking Poilievre versus other candidates. And I was speaking with some Conservatives today who are very concerned that their party is not governable, and that issues like this abortion question that is being brought up with the U.S. Supreme Court just highlight how difficult it is to manage this party, to manage the different factions and keep it all together. And they are skeptical whether it still is possible.
Okay, let's turn to a Conservative in this country who's had a little bit more success. Let's talk about the Ontario election, John. It's underway. It's an Ontario election, but it could have an effect on federal politics too, one might think. If Doug Ford wins again, is there a message there for the federal Conservatives on, in fact, what it takes to win more seats in Ontario? And for the federal Liberals who've tacked left with the deal with the federal NDP, and could there be a message there, and whether some of the seats in that province, Liberal seats, could be in peril because of that?
Well, a lot of ground there, but I think that clearly if Ford wins convincingly, then that kind of moderate G-shucks kind of conservatism that Ford specialises in is obviously resonating. I bet he was glad that Justin Trudeau was at his unofficial campaign launch yesterday at the car plant, right. The former Chrysler electric vehicle announcement. Both seem to be quite comfortable with that arrangement. We know that Ontario quite often likes a federal government of one flavour and a provincial government of another. There does not seem to be an upsurge of opinion that wants to boot Doug Ford right now. It seems to me that he's going to cruise quite comfortably and probably under the radar. I don't think they're going to put him out front very often. Straight back into another majority right now. The Liberals have not really been able to, the provincial Liberals have not really been able to disrupt that pattern, it seems to me.
Let me hear finally from you, Marieke, on that, on sort of how you think, sort of things we've talked about and sort of implications in the Ontario race for the federal politics.
I think John's right. The sense in Ontario seems to be that this is Doug Ford's to win or lose, depending on how you want to frame it, that he is really the man to beat. I think the question is, do we see the opposition or the no Ford vote coalesce around the NDP or the Liberals? If that does happen, then he's up for a bigger challenge, I think. But if it remains split between the NDP and the Liberals, then that's where you see that opportunity for the Progressive Conservatives to win another government. And certainly the dynamic could not be more different from 4 years ago when he was running the first time and targeting Kathleen Wynne and Justin Trudeau. Now he and Trudeau are apparently the best of buds, and party stripes don't matter.
All right, Marieke Walsh, John Ivison, thank you both for your time tonight. Good to see you again. Take care. We'll talk soon.
Thanks.
Thank you.
That's all for another edition of Primetime Politics on CPAC. I'm Peter Van Dusen. From all of us here at CPAC, thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.